Hello and welcome to my lecture on Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 3, Biopsychology. Now it's important to recognize that almost all of the chapters within Introduction to Psychology represent fields within themselves. There's an entire field called biopsychology, a subdivision of psychology, but also bringing in genetics and biology, ecology, and other sciences. All important, very multidisciplinary, just like developmental psych or perception and personality, intelligence, cognition. Each one of those areas is a whole world in and of itself. In this survey class, we're going to kind of take a really generalist look at the nervous system and how the brain works, how the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the spinal cord, all of that stuff, how that all works as we begin to explore biopsychology. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the absolutely amazing and crazy complex brain. According to science, our brain represents the most complex object in the known universe. And here's some statistics for you to ponder. Here you have the brain, kind of a picture of a typical human brain. There are 100,000 miles of blood vessels inside of each brain. You could take those blood vessels, well, you can't really do it, but if you did, and stretch them out, and it would go around the world 4 times. Every single brain. It has the consistency of jello, like a jello mold. It's much more squishy than if you've ever had any opportunity to do dissection on a sheep brain or something like that, maybe in school. Those are much stiffer because of the formaldehyde that they were stored into. The brain is actually very squishy. In a rough and tumble incident, like a collision or something, the brain is flopping around inside of the skull, really, and that's kind of where brain injuries come from. You know, if you have a head-on collision, the brain squishes to the front and then back, and then it kind of jiggles back and forth. So you get frontal cortex damage and potentially occipital lobe stimulation. So the seeing of lights when somebody has an accident, it's usually the stimulation of the occipital lobe during that bouncing around phase in the brain. It is the fattest organ in the body, usually to store energy because of the importance of the organ. It's about 3 pounds. They estimate we probably have about 70,000 thoughts per day. There are 100 billion neurons, 100 billion, 100 trillion connections, synapses. Now, to get a sense of that 100 trillion, you look at that bottom graphic, you have the brain, you have a bunch of dollar bills, and you have not a really good representation of it, but that's the moon. If we had a dollar bill for every single synapse, we could line up those dollar bills back to back, end to end, and go to the moon and back 20,282 times. That is a big, big number. One of the principal things that we want to jump right into, it's a little bit a kind of a interesting aspect of the brain, is that it is divided into 2 hemispheres. If you study human biology and you look at how the brain controls and manages the body, you know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, this sort of crossing over. And there's some speculation that the right part of the brain and the left part of the brain have different functions and that we have dominance associated with that. Now, in reality, the brain has much more plasticity than that. That functions that would normally be in the right side of the brain can and do appear in the left side of the brain. And usually the complexity of our behaviors involves many areas of the brain that are all working together. So the true left-right side brain kind of thing and personalities associated with people who are more right brain or more left brain has more to do with the complexity of personality than it has to do with the actual neurological structures. Nonetheless, it's an interesting conversation to have because it has such history in the field of psychology. So if you look at this graphic, you'll see that left functions are usually associated with analytical thought, logical language, science and math, truth, recognizing things, planning, and plan running. And on the right functions, we have holistic thought, intuition, creativity, art and music, imagination, appreciation, purpose, and flexibility. So we can kind of play around with this, maybe discuss this, and talk about them, discuss with people that you know in the course, and discussion boards about how is this, how do you feel about that? Do you think that you're more right-brained or more left-brained? And kind of speculate about that particular piece, even though it doesn't really hold a lot of validity in the research. Now, the basic building block of the nervous system is the neuron. And here is a basic sort of, very simplistic graphic representation of a neuron. And if we look at the different parts, we have the cell body on the left-hand side. That's the pink with the sort of fiery branches coming out of it. And that is called the soma. The soma is a Latin for body. Inside is the nucleus, just like has all the other little organelles and going on with regular cells. Stretching out from there, we have structures called dendrites, and these dendrites connect with other parts of other neurons or muscle tissue. And those form part of the synapse that we're going to look at next, which is the ways in which one neuron connects with another. We have on the other end, we have the axon terminals. This is the distal end of the neuron, and this is when the signal goes from left to right on this image, and the signals coming in from the dendrites processed in the soma travel along the axon and go to the terminal buttons at the end. Again, there are synapses there for that biochemical electrical process. Now, the axon, in some cells it's difficult to determine what is the axon, but in this kind of clear graphic here, we have the axon, which is kind of the longer, distance covering part of the communication system, and it has some peculiar characteristics to it. Now, the axon is often surrounded by a fatty tissue called myelin, and that myelin serves to increase the efficiency of the electrical conductivity of the axon. In all truth, the electrical charge which generates in the soma travels along the axon and actually jumps or is actually relayed across the myelin and then to the nodes of Ranvier, where the axon is again exposed to the biochemical processes to keep that signal passing along the axon. Now, the Schwann cells create the myelin, and myelin is the component of the brain, the component of the nervous system, that when we refer to white matter versus gray matter, white matter has myelin. Gray matter has no myelin, or it's less myelinated, so it looks gray. So the color of myelin is white. So the brain is our gray matter. There's not a lot of myelin in the brain. The only part of the brain that is heavily myelinated is the corpus callosum, which is a band of neurons that connect the hemispheres. The peripheral nervous system, that the nerves all over our body are largely myelinated because those signals have to travel much further distances, and we need that efficiency in order to have coordinated movement, very, very fast relay of information going from one part of our body to the other, up to 200 miles an hour. And if you think about 200 miles an hour going this far, that's incredibly fast, and how the nervous system translates a signal from one end to the next. So the process by which a neuron impulse actually happens within the body, it would be referred to as a biochemical electrical process. The direction of the impulse is from left to right on this screen, and here is a graphic of On the left is the distal terminal button, and on the right is the receiving the receptor on the next neuron. So what happens in this process is, in the presynaptic neuron moving information to the postsynaptic neuron, we get an electrical potential building up, comes on the end of the, kind of looking at the end of the process that occurs on this particular cell, and the electrical process comes down. It allows the cell membrane to become permeable to calcium, and that triggers the release of neurotransmitters. You can see that in this area. You have chemicals that are released from vesicles inside of the presynaptic neuron, and they float, I guess, across the synapse, which is a space in between the neurons. They're actually not touching each other. There's this space that is allowed for neurochemicals or neurotransmitters to drift across that synapse and connect to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Now, there's a number of neurotransmitters. That's something that you can look at in depth more in the biopsychology class, but those have a number of different functions depending on the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. They attach to the receptors, and some of them activate. They promote an electrical signal to keep on going down. So they open up the ion channels on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron in order to increase the electrical potential on that neuron to the point that it fires the next neuron along the chain. Sometimes, however, the neurotransmitters have an inhibition effect on the postsynaptic neuron. They will actually close ion channels. So there's parts of the nervous system that stop the nerve impulse from going to the next place. Once they are used, they are released back into the synaptic gap, where they are either destroyed or they are reuptaked into the presynaptic neuron and recycled for the next sequence in the biochemical electrical process. The actual neurochemicals themselves operate, you can almost see this as there's on the presynaptic neuron, there's a chemical factories that produce keys. Let's just call them keys. And on the postsynaptic neuron are locks that will either open ion channels or close ion channels, and then the key will be released back to come back into the factory. So they get released, and if the key goes in and it fits the actual shape of the actual chemical bonds to the receptor part of the neuron and turns it on, turns it off in terms of opening up ion channels on the postsynaptic cell. There's a field in chemistry called stereochemistry, and what that is, it's the actual physical shape of compounds. Water, for example, you probably see there's a H2O, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, and the angle at which the hydrogens are bonded to the oxygen is a very specific angle, and that particular angle is responsible, because of its peculiar angle, it's not 90 degrees, because of its peculiar angle, water has the unique quality that almost nothing else in the world has, of when it gets frozen, it actually expands. Because of that angle, that physical angle, they can't really fit together and they expand. Almost everything else, when it gets colder, it shrinks because the molecules are able to fit together. Moving from that, stereochemistry defines these keys. You think about a key having a particular shape in order for it to unlock or lock a door. This works largely the same way. So chemicals that are built within the body to unlock doors and lock doors can also exist within other chemicals that we come in contact with. So those chemicals may be prescription drugs, recreational drugs, or even everyday drugs that we expose ourselves that act like neurotransmitters and impact the nervous system. either by unlocking ion channels or locking ion channels in different parts of the body. And the actual result of that process produces different sorts of experiences for that individual. So if we're going to look at prescription drugs, for example, and we look at something like fentanyl, that is very similar in terms of its structure, not in terms of these diagrams here, because these are two-dimensional diagrams, but three-dimensionally they will unlock the same channels. So fentanyl is very similar to endorphins, specifically endomorphin, which is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter. The result of that is a feeling of pleasure, a getting high, a well-being, and no pain. So you can see how individuals may become addicted to fentanyl because it mimics natural feel-good hormones that exist within our body, such as endomorphin. An example of a recreational drug, here's LSD. That's similar to serotonin, a very, very fundamental neurotransmitter throughout the body. And both LSD and serotonin will result in mood changes, feelings change, eating habits, digestion, sleeping, and of course cognitive part. Serotonin is a huge part of our brain, ability to process information, and of course the ultimate impact of LSD is to modify that. So we'll see how those, it's actually the shape of these are similar keys that are unlocking the same kind of receptors. And finally, we look at everyday drugs, say like nicotine, that people would get from smoking cigarettes, is similar to acetylcholine, another very common neurotransmitter in our brain. And this also affects mood, affects our heart rate, affects the release of dopamine, another neurotransmitter. It activates the reward centers within our brain and provides us with some pleasure. So it is actually the shape of these drugs that formulate a key that unlocks aspects of the brain, and we would refer to these as the psychoactive component of any drug. And every chemical has some degree of psychoactive effect. In fact, when we're looking at prescribing medications for psychiatric illnesses or for pain, we're actually trying purposefully to impact the nervous system. If we're taking something for pain, we're not necessarily doing anything at the actual site. That's another treatment place. What are we going to do to reduce infection, to protect the area, to close the wound, to reduce bleeding, those kinds of things? That happens at the area. The painkiller that we take doesn't affect that area. It affects the whole body and reduces your sensitivity to pain, sometimes in the central nervous system, sometimes in the peripheral nervous system, sometimes both. And the ultimate effect is I feel that pain less than I would have if I didn't have that assistant to kind of boost up and limit the amount of pain that I'm experiencing from that wound. Now, the entire human nervous system is made up of two basic systems. There's the central nervous system, or the CNS, and that's made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is actually part of the central nervous system, even though it's peripheral to the brain, the cord going down the back, but it's actually part of the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves that go out to our bodies. And we see this graphic is in the course book. You can see the parasympathetic nerves and the sympathetic nerves. These are activating and relaxing components of the nervous system. So sympathetic nerves activate our system, such as in fight or flight, where our eyes become dilated, we have salivation, it inhibits the salivation, we relax our airways, we increase our heart rate, all the things that would be excitatory. And then parasympathetic nerves, this is in the peripheral nervous system, help calm you down. So in sort of a general way, we can think about when we are getting ourselves revved up for something, we're activating our sympathetic nervous system. When we are trying to relax through meditation and focusing or just deep breathing, we're activating our parasympathetic nervous system, help relax our bodies. Okay, now let's take a look. We're going to spend some time looking at the central nervous system. We're going to start with the spinal cord here. Here's a graphic, and we're going to take a little journey in this graphic here. Here we have a cross section of the spinal cord. And we'll see right here what we have is the body of the vertebrae. This is where your discs would be, a large portion of there. There's a bony structure that's very protective of the spinal cord inside. You see these blue things right here are actually nerves that are going out through the spaces in the spinal cord and out to the body. And when you have a disc rupture, or there's something wrong, degeneration of the discs, and the plates of the spinal cord become compressed, it's the pressure on these extensions out there that cause pain, paralysis, numbness, tingling feelings, and all that stuff that people have when they have relatively mild spinal cord injury going on. Not that it's mild all the time, but certainly not like a severing of the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord itself, we have white matter, of course. This is the myelinated component of the spinal cord that travels very fast. And then we have the gray matter that processes information quickly but it processes it right there, almost clearly without the brain. Now, the brain is not involved in some of these things get processed. Information gets processed right there and sent back out to the muscles. So let's say when we have reflexes. So we have the knee reflex. You take a little hammer. Your doc takes a little hammer and goes on your pituitary. No, that's the wrong. Patula, something like that. Hits that tendon and our leg kicks up. That information never makes it to the brain. It travels from your knee to your spinal cord, gets processed in the gray matter of the spinal cord and sent right back up to your muscles to have that reflex. And our reflexes often work that way. Some of our other functions and reflexes below us, wherever the spinal cord is, it is involved in the things below that. So as you're going up and down, the higher in the spinal cord controls things in the top part of the body all the way down to the end of the spinal cord that will control your feet and your legs and that kind of thing. So there is some processing that does happen right in the spinal cord. The spinal cord itself is made up of 3 layers. The pia mater is a very delicate membrane that is on the inside and wraps the actual spinal cord. And then we have the arachnoid, which is a sort of a suspension cushioning mechanism that allows for some movement of the spinal cord within the spinal column. And then the dura mater. This is a very tough protective membrane around that area. And when I say tough, it's if you're doing spinal cord surgery, you need to lean into this one. It's one of the very, very tough materials. The meningeal layers around our brain are the same way. This very, very tough material that we have generated to protect these areas of our brain that are very sensitive. So let's take a little bit, looking at the spinal cord itself, we can see that particular aspects of our functioning are located and the information comes from these areas. And look up here in the cervical area, you have the head, neck, diaphragm, deltoid, biceps, wrists, triceps, and your hands. All these things at the top, but the diaphragm, which is way down right below our lungs. If someone gets damage, a spinal cord injury in this area, they're most likely, first, if it's high enough, they're most likely to not survive it. Second, below that, you'll see individuals who have lost not only the function of their entire bodies, but they can't even breathe on their own. That person would have to be on an artificial respirator. And then we get the degrees of function that can happen with a very high level neck injury that will involve the legs for a paraplegic status, or the legs and arms for a quadrilegic status of their. Now, paraplegic means they have the inability to use their legs, or there's some functional diminishing in their legs. They're not to be completely paralyzed, but it affects two of their limbs. Quadriplegics, there's paralysis that affects all their limbs to different degrees. So in my work in home health, I've worked with a lot of people with have spinal cord injury. One individual that I met was injured in a rugby accident, very, very high level. I think it was probably C2, like any higher, and probably would not have survived. And the circumstances where he had no movement of his arms, there was no purposeful movement of his limbs, and he was on a ventilator. There's another individual that I've worked with who actually, look, it's kind of involved down here, had thoracic nerves damaged. When they wrecked their snowmobile, they hurt the curved part of their back, right in between the shoulder blades. And that individual does have quadriplegia because they had some limited movement of their hands. They can have gross motor, but not a whole lot of fine motor, but can't use their legs at all. Still, what would we consider quadriplegia, but can move his arms around. He's not on a ventilator. Much higher quality of life, even though he's significantly disabled by that. So as we move down the spinal cord here, we look at the lumbar nerves. This is where leg muscles come from. And then finally the sacral nerves, bowel, bladder, and sexual function. Now, remember, when we were having those injuries way at the top, that means everything below is injured. So the person I know who had the thoracic injury also lost leg muscles, also lost bowel and bladder, also lost sexual function. Now, there's some aspects, there's been some research that's been going on in terms of being able to actually manually stimulate through electronics to control bladder and to control some sexual functions, such as having an erection. And those individuals have actually been able to have a higher quality of life, B, have children, to be able to actually experience that the actual fundamental process of having an erection and an orgasm for a man is one of those processes that is taken care of at the level of the spinal cord. So, of course, the brain is involved in the sexuality of it and in the intimacy and passion of that of having sex, but the nerves in the spinal cord, if the person's had an injury in the upper part of their spinal cord, the nerves down there are still intact and they can be stimulated to do their job even though the signals are not coming from the brain. And so for some individuals, this is an incredible breakthrough in their ability to have as much a normal life as they can. In fact, in the work that I've done with people of various levels of paralysis, being able to go to the bathroom independently is like the biggest deal. It's just, my experience has been individuals have been very, very much looking forward to treatments that can do that. Those are becoming readily available with stimulators that will actually hold the bowel, and then you press a button and it releases the bowel, and the person can do that on their own. Is completely life-changing for individuals with this level of injury. So, cool stuff happening in biopsychology. Let's take a look at the brain now, the brain itself and its structures. Here we have sort of this cutaway aspect. Doesn't look like the other picture I had of the brain at all, but the frontal lobe is on your left, and the back of this is a person looking sideways. You're looking sideways on the brain. The front of the brain on the left, the back of the brain is on the right. So let's take a little journey in here, and we look here at the cerebral cortex, that very typical rounded, convoluted part of the brain. The ultimate control, this is executive functioning and information processing, happens on that surface area. Here down, kind of above the palate, if you kind of consider, what's right above the palate in your mouth, those functions. If we looked at the brain parts there, we see the hypothalamus, very key in controlling maintenance, eating, endocrine system, and it's very much linked to the emotional and reward system here. This is lots of research going into the hypothalamus when it comes to eating disorders and substance abuse, because it relates to those kind of mechanisms that would provide reward when we're doing those kind of things. Next to that, we have the pituitary. That's the master endocrine gland. And interestingly enough, this releases timing type hormones all over the body and to the brain. Now, this is a little off topic, but in Eastern philosophy, there's often reference to what people would refer to as the third eye, which is an intuitive ability to perceive the world. And in Indian, like India philosophy, it's considered right there. Now, historians are kind of looking at that and saying, okay, where could that concept have come from? And they think that it might actually arise from an intuition-based knowledge of the pituitary gland and its importance in terms of stimulating different parts of the brain. That's just speculation, but its location right in kind of like the middleness, like if you, right above your soft palate, when the surface of your mouth ends and it becomes soft, right up there, kind of central, kind of like if there was a little person in a driving seat of your brain, that's where they would be sitting. And that location been correlated to the kind of controlling functions and ability to perceive things that come from third eye philosophy. So just interesting little component connecting the ancient world to the modern one. In the midbrain, here, this is the top of the spinal cord where it connects to the rest of the brain. You see movement, eye movements, and auditory and visual processing. The pons are involved in the control of breathing, sensation, hearing, taste, and balance. These are directly behind your throat and is where the pons are. And that's what they do. So here we have more to the bottom and the back of the brain. We have the spinal cord that we just talked about. We have the medulla, which helps regulate breathing, heart, and blood vessel function. Injury up at this level, this is C1 and above, people usually don't survive. We have the cerebellum that coordinates voluntary movements and balance and supports memories. So like physical memory or muscle memory is located within the cerebellum. And the amygdala, very, very important, linking person's emotions. And we go up into the inside of the brain. We have what I've already, we have the hippocampus, which is linked to memory. We have the fornix, which is actually an output tract for the hippocampus going to different parts of the brain. The thalamus, which regulates messages between the lower brain and the cerebral cortex. This is how we become aware that we're hungry, aware that we're moving about, these kinds of things. It brings those things to awareness. And then finally, the part of the brain I talked about, the corpus callosum, which is the fibrous myelinated tissue that exists between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So, and this is really, I'm going to say it's gross anatomy, not gross icky, it's big anatomy. There are layers upon layers of complexity within the brain, far beyond these particular things that we've discussed here. The last thing I want to discuss in this lecture is part of the peripheral nervous system. As a communication system, there's messages that go out to move a muscle, let's say, and there's messages that come in to tell me that my hand is on something hot. And those involve two different systems. There's a system that sends information out, and there's another system that brings information in. And that's represented in this graphic here. Let's say we have dendrites on the surface of the skin that we call neurons that are sensitive to pain. That sends information toward the spinal cord. Those are called afferent nerves, the ones that are moving from the outside to the central nervous system. The central nervous system will either process them at the spinal cord or send information up to the brain for processing. And even in your eyes, there's no spinal cord. Your eyes send information to the occipital lobe. Those are afferent nerves sending them back. But then there's going to be processes from the brain sending muscle movements to your eye for your eye to move around. We get into that in biopsych, and it's very cool how we move, how we coordinate eye movements in order to keep something in the center of our visual plane. Just extremely cool. Signals coming out from the spinal cord, or maybe just directly from the brain if we're looking at our eyes and our mouth and stuff like that, those are called efferent nerves, and they come out to the muscle. So in a typical situation here, I'll touch something hot, it sends information through the afferent nerve system up to my mind, tells me that it's hot. My brain says, move your hand. That goes back down to the efferent system out to my muscle to make out to my muscles, numerous muscles, in order to pull my hand back. It's remarkable to think about that synapse process happening between each cell. Now, if I touch my hand with a needle right there and I'm going to send pain, that's not necessarily one big long neuron. There might be hundreds of neurons that are sending that information. And in between each one of those neurons, you have to have those chemicals moving across that gap to the point that it stimulates the next nerve. You would think that click, 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 each neuron's, moving along, but yet it happens almost instantaneously. That all those chemical reactions happen within that 200 miles an hour thing is, whether it's one long neuron or whether it's 100 or 1,000 neurons going from one place to the next, that's how fast the system runs. So pretty amazing. So I encourage you to read deep into this material, read external stuff, look up biopsych, look up any one of these things. There's lots of great stuff on the web. And if you ever have the opportunity to take biopsychology, jump on it. It's very dense material because we've been learning a lot, but just like most of psychology, every time we discover something, there's 10 more questions that comes out of it. So hence, this is why we like psychology. All right, so I'll see you next time, and we'll go over the next chapter in the course. And until then, have a great day.